You know, here at the break, there was a question. The question was, well, you know, the Chinese are really doing a lot of sediment management. Have they kind of picked this stuff up from your research? I could only wish. No, I've learned from them. They're the world's pioneers in sediment management because they have a river called the Yellow River. And it's called yellow because it's full of sediment. It makes our Missouri River look like tap water. Sometimes the Yellow River carries more sediment than water. And in the 1950s, the Soviet Union did the Chinese a favor. They built the first dam on the Yellow River, called the Sanmenxia Dam. It was closed about the same time that Gavins Point was. Well, the Russians had no experience with rivers with a lot of sediment in them. So they didn't provide any way of moving the sediment from the upstream side of the dam on the Yellow River to the downstream side. Its fate was to drop out. And it did so really, really, really fast. The reservoir was filling with sediment within the first 10 years. Well, this dam was very important to the Chinese for flood control and for hydroelectric production. So, not being a capitalistic economy, they just went in and spent the money necessary to fix the dam. So what did they do? They put in large, low-level outlets so they could pass the flood wave carrying most of the sediment on downstream. It helped, but not enough. So there was a second reconstruction project. They installed more large, low-level outlets in the Sanmenxia Dam. And it's been operating successfully ever since. The reservoir is about 50% full of sediment. And they've sacrificed that forever. But they're not going to lose the second half. Because when it begins to cloud up and they've got a monsoon climate, very dependable flood season, they just empty the reservoir. And they let the floodwaters go through on downstream. Since that time, they built another dam upstream from Sanmenxia. It's called Xiaolongdi. And that dam manages sediment because upstream the sediment-laden water comes into the clear reservoir and dives to the bottom of the reservoir because it weighs so much. There's so much sediment in the water, it sinks. And it flows in the Yellow River submerged underneath the lake. Makes it all the way to the dam. And they built large, low-level outlets. So without dropping the water level in the dam, they open these outlets and out comes the muddiest water you can ever imagine. It came from upstream, dropped beneath the water, ran along the bed, and right out the bottom. So the Chinese, by necessity, have learned how to manage sediment. We didn't invent that because, gratefully, in almost all areas of the U.S., we're blessed with low sediment in our reservoirs. So we've learned it from the Chinese. We have a little problem importing that technology, and I'll touch on that here in a few minutes, but they know what they're doing. All right, so what can be done? I'd like to share with you a couple of examples from around the world about what can be done. Basically, we've got three choices. You can try to protect the watershed upstream and reduce the amount of sediment coming in. Or you can intercept the sediment as it enters the reservoir and run it around the lake and downstream. Or you can say, okay, we're going to let the sediment drop out, and then we're going to remove it. So I'll touch on these three topics now. The first one about watershed protection, it sounds so romantic, but it's usually not that effective. If you can increase the vegetation covering your watershed. But that depends on a climate and soils amenable to vegetation. Not often done. Only done once. again in the Yellow River, where they had more than 1 million people involved in planting vegetation. More than 1 million. Okay? Hard for us to do that here. You can increase sediment storage. You can do that by building more storage structures. For example, thousands of small gully plugs, again, the Yellow River in China. The gullies that had eroded upstream and were contributing a lot of sediment to the Yellow River, they were plugged up with structures no taller than this. When those fill in with sediment, the local folks were allowed to grow crops and keep the income instead of contributing it to the state. So there was an incentive there, a financial incentive, and that's worked pretty well. Or you can build a larger dam upstream to store the sediment. Now, this ultimately is a temporary solution, but it does slow down. Now, what's going on here? We've got 6 upstream dams. They're huge. But you've got the Niobrara River. When I was talking to Paul Boyd a couple of months ago, he's a little bit younger than I am. I don't know how long he's worked there, but he saw the reconnaissance studies for Gavins Point Dam. Early on, it was thought to place the dam upstream from the Niobrara River. You already knew that. That would have been nice. But placing it where it is makes it a problem. Okay, not always successful. Okay, so how about bypassing sediment? Japan takes this very seriously. Small island nation, mountainous, lots of monsoon rains, high intensity, lots of soil erosion. Reservoir is going to fill up with sediment. What do? In some cases, they intercept most of the river before it enters the reservoir. They build a tunnel through the mountains, and they channel that sediment-laden water through the tunnel. Here's a video. I'm not sure how to make this go. This is the Miwan Dam in Japan. This is the bypass tunnel. This is the dam itself, car going over the top. The outlet tunnel is discharging into the river downstream. That is muddy water. You can see all the woody debris here that's already been washed down through the tunnel. This is the outlet from the tunnel carrying sediment-laden water. That's not depositing in the reservoir. It's being moved downstream, where it would go naturally if the dam weren't there. So this is called bypassing sediment. Notice they've protected the stream bed here and banks. So what do you need for that? You need a mountain with hard rock, and you need a curve in the river so the tunnel won't be too long. And then you might consider this. Now let's talk about removing sediment deposits. How can we get the sediment out of the reservoir once it's dropped out? Well, sluicing under pressure, and by the way, these videos are courtesy of a colleague of mine, George Annandale. Sandy, you might want to invite him sometime. There's three of us who do this work primarily. George is one. Now this first of all shows a laboratory where this is sediment in a stream and this is water in a dam, and water is going this way, and a little sluice gate is raised here, and so water is going to move the sediment downstream. So the video is still running. That's good. All right. So they wanted to get rid of the background. In this case, there's pressure here. You don't lower the reservoir all the way. You just lower it a little bit. What it does is it removes the sediment immediately in front of the dam. Doesn't do that much more for you. This doesn't seem to be doing very much. So let's see this in action then. This is a case where the entire reservoir is drawn down. And this is what was simulated for the Corps of Engineers by Ted Yang, colleague of mine in Colorado. This is Gavins Point. You empty it. And then the high water velocity moves the sand. Now this assumes that the sand is already there, which in the case of Gavins Point it's not. But this is how the Chinese manage their sediment to a large extent. They build their reservoirs so they're a little bit smaller, and by the way, Gavins Point is small, and they empty it. Another one is shown on the right. This is Yankton Dam in Switzerland. Imagine building a dam at the base of the Alps. Low-level outlet, they are lowering the water surface in the reservoir. And they opened the gate and you saw how muddy the water was. Now, it's really important to try to control the sediment concentration, because if it's too high, it'll kill every fish downstream that's there. And so it's nice to try to replicate the sediment concentration that's coming in to the reservoir. So notice how narrow that is in a mountain gorge in the Alps. So this technique works under certain circumstances. South Africa does drawdown flushing as well. This is the result of some numerical modeling, and I'll lay it out for you here. This is the dam, this is the reservoir. See these lines? This represents the stream bed and a gully forming in the stream bed due to the erosion of sediment as the water level is dropped. So we can do some numerical modeling stuff, and this was done for Gavins Point, but the deposition didn't occur until like up in here. All this is pretty clear. Okay. So this is the study done for Gavins Point. I think you're familiar with it. And the problem, as I mentioned at the beginning, in answer to your question, so now I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit. The problem at Gavins Point, the gates are 20 feet above the stream bed. Sands won't go. Here's one of the recommendations. In addition, modifications to the dam infrastructure should be considered to provide higher energy slope for sediment movement. Well, what's that mean in English? A translation, please. It means simulate a situation where all the gates at Gavins Point are at stream bed level. You can simulate it with a computer program and not do anybody any damage. And well, we ought to do it just for interest's sake. Okay, another technique is called hydraulic dredging. And this is a case that I'm working on in central Utah, where you do use a dredge in a pretty small reservoir, and you add muddy water to the clear water spillway. This is the muddy water coming from the dredge pipe. This is the clear water. This is the difference between what you have coming into the reservoir and what you have going out normally. All I'm trying to do there is restore a sediment balance across the dam. Now the folks downstream, what are they going to see? They're going to see muddy water. And in this case, they're very happy about it because they want to preserve that storage capacity. There's no fishing downstream, no recreational benefit. Okay, so now I'd like to go into the final part of the presentation and talk about why do we have all these problems anyway? Isn't there something we could have done to avoid it? Well, why are we where we are today? And so I'll try to address those issues. It's due a lot, not entirely, but to the short-sighted nature of planning. Now, one of you is a planner. I don't mean to offend you at all, but we use a pretty short planning time horizon here. Everybody started using the cost-benefit approach beginning in 1936 with the Corps of Engineers, and here's why. You're going to build a dam? Okay. You've got several alternatives to consider. A low dam, a high dam, concrete dam, earth dam. Lots of spillways, no spillways. You got maybe 8 alternatives. All those alternatives provide some benefit, monetary benefit, and they all have costs. Well, how can you compare apples and oranges? How can you compare alternatives and make them understandable? Well, it was decided back then that what you can do is make a list and just put down all the costs and all the benefits of all your alternatives. And then, because they occur over several years, you want to do something economically with a calculator. You want to quote-unquote discount all of them to present-day values. For example, if I receive $1 of benefit 50 years from now, how much would it be worth in today's dollars? Think of it. 50 years from now, you get $1. How much would that be worth today? Well, it's easier to imagine it the other way around. How much would you have to put in a bank today to have $1 50 years from now? Okay? So all of these are discounted to present value, and then you can compare. Now, it's done using an interest rate. It's called interest rate, discount factor. It's also called exponential. Now, the reason I put these phrases here is so when you see a report about this kind of stuff and you start seeing these phrases, that you'll kind of get what they're talking about. Otherwise, it can be really confusing. So that's a little bit of vocabulary. So let's take an example. Here's the question. How fast does the value of money decline with time? Here in time is 0 to 100 years. And here is $1, and at a discount rate of, say, 4%, we lose its value very rapidly, like this. This is how dams in the United States have been financed. This is the usual design life of a dam, between 50 and 100 years. What does that mean, design life? Does that mean the concrete is going to break up? Does it mean the earth is going to crumble? Not at all. The material in the infrastructure can last hundreds of years. So what's this 50 or 100 years? That's strictly financial. Only financial. Only. It's just a financial concept. And the idea is that any benefit farther than, say, 50 years into the future, when discounted to today's dollars, is worthless. For example, $1 of benefit 50 years in the future will be worth about 2 cents in today's dollars. Or looking at it the opposite way, you can see how the value of money decreases with time. Using this curve right here, which is the one we have used. After 50 years, it's worth about 3 cents. After 100 years, basically worth less. What does this mean? By the way, this is the approach used to build all these dams, shown here. Dam construction in the U.S. This is 19,768 dams built in a 10-year period in the 1960s. Here's the Gavins Point era right here. 11,475 dams built in the U.S. Total of them all up, you've got nearly 100,000 dams of consequence built in the U.S. They were all designed using the concept I've just described. What does that mean? Here's what it means. Your planners will say, we can't afford to incorporate sediment management when we build the dam. The immediate capital cost of putting in like gates from bank to bank as tall as the dam, that cost we can't afford because the benefits don't come through. And our benefit cost ratio would be adversely affected. In other words, this is a ratio. This is all the incoming money. That's all the outgoing money. If that ratio is less than 1, the project won't be built. So it means that sediment management is not considered at the design stage. And the bill, so to speak, has come due today for you, your children, and grandchildren. And that's why it's this economic approach that we've taken. But if that's not enough, I mean, we're using a short time horizon. we might be able to say, well, okay, all right, we'll play your game. But then what I tell the planners is, hey, at least let's be fair. Let's be fair about this and include all of the costs and all of the benefits. For example, no one has asked this question. What are the costs due to not managing sediment? What monetary damage occurs? And if you spent the money up front to avoid that, you could avoid those, and that's a benefit. Let me illustrate. Gavins Point Dam. Closed 1957. Why is it there? It's pretty small from Corps of Engineers standards. It looks pretty large to us, including me. I went out there last night. It looks huge. But compared to the other 6, it's really small. Why is it there? It's supposed to re-regulate the flow of the Missouri River so there aren't huge spikes and drops. Huge spikes and drops. Average annual discharge, 30,000 CFS, things like that. And as you know, it was built downstream from the Niobrara. Here are the Congress-controlled benefits. Now, what's happened? In 1957, the dam cost $50 million to build. If I were to bring that cost forward, how much would it cost to rebuild Gavins Point today? $368 million. That's how much it would cost to build it today, using the same approach that we used back then. But, you know, the city of Niobrara had to be relocated, and that cost $20 million in 2015 dollars. Real estate acquisition has been going on for decades. Farmers' land is flooded, the Corps just buys the land. $17 million. Highway 12 maintenance. This is just maintenance in Nebraska. $1.6 million. The entire Highway 12 in Nebraska is going to have to be moved. It's going to have to be moved higher. The water levels are now reaching the sub-base of the pavement, cracking up, breaking up, becoming dangerous. That will cost $161 million. And then what about building sandbars downstream for lease, turn, and piping plover? $56 million. The bill for not managing sediment at Gavins Point right now is about $258 million. Well, that's 70% of the cost of the dam. None of it was figured into that benefit cost analysis. This number was put at 0. And you know what? This estimate that my graduate student and I are publishing this year in a refereed journal is low. Why is it low? Because the only downstream damages are the cost of reconstructing those sand channel islands immediately downstream from the dam. The unraveling eastern Nebraska, western Iowa tributaries, their impacts on infrastructure, relocation of water collection, and such, none of that has been included in the previous table. So this number, $258 million, which is about 70% of the cost of the dam, is low. So all I'm asking is, let's at least play fair. If we're going to use this benefit cost analysis, if that's what we're mandated to use by law, then let's just be fair about it and include all the damages. Well, you're sitting there thinking, thanks a lot. That doesn't really help us a whole lot here. It was difficult to get these figures. I had to go through the Freedom of Information Act request, and it took 4 or 5 months for these figures to come our way. The Corps isn't hiding them. Their staff, though, just really don't have the time to dig through the drawers. Okay, so what can be done? This is the second time through. You might replace the existing gates with gates that extend to the stream bed, etc. I've already shown you this slide. Let me show you another one. There's a little bit of hope. There's a little bit of hope, if not a lot of hope for Gavins Point. There is hope for the rest of the world. Dam building is very active worldwide. New dams will likely be built here in the U.S. I know they're not very popular right now, but in a generation we'll likely be building more dams. Okay, when we do, let's do it right. How can we avoid these issues? By using some discount rate concepts, completing all the costs and benefits, and I'll end on this one right here. So I've got about 5 minutes to go, just so you know what we're looking at, okay? First of all, I showed you this graph early on and said this is the curve that we follow that has been followed for all 80,000 dams constructed in the U.S. It doesn't have to be that way. We can use this curve right here, which is called hyperbolic discounting, or this curve, which is called logistic discounting. What do? They increase the value of money over time when compared to the traditional exponential rate. It keeps up the value of money. The hyperbolic approach values future generations more. I think you'll agree that by financing all of our dams in the U.S., we're really not thinking about the next generation or the generation after that. We're thinking about our generation. Now, if we keep the value of that dollar higher, we're beginning to value more our children and grandchildren. This is a brand new approach. The logistic approach, not yet proven, but very promising in keeping the value of money higher, greater into the future, which would allow people to feel more comfortable investing in more capital infrastructure up front, like larger gates, bigger gates, going down to the stream bed. Okay, I've already showed you the impacts of not considering the costs of sedimentation. You know, we can predict these impacts now. We may not have been able to predict them in 1957. We knew about Niobrara. The Corps knew that they would have to relocate Niobrara. They knew that. But the other ones it may not have known of. But we can now predict those impacts and costs. And it would likely result with sediment management from the beginning. Here's the example from the Mekong River. The Mekong River runs through several countries. Its headwaters are in China. It goes through Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia on its way to the ocean. Those countries would like to develop their economies, just like we have. So what do they want to do? They want to build hundreds of dams on the Mekong River and its tributaries. Can't blame them. They want the same lifestyle that we have. Can we apply what we've learned to that situation? It's quite a challenge, but there's progress being made. Instead of a huge dam that spans the entire Mekong, the preferred alternative now is a much smaller dam that spans most of the Mekong that will allow for sediment passage and fish passage downstream. The ideal goal is not to shrink the delta at the mouth of the Mekong River, because that's where all the fish are for those millions and millions of people. So the World Bank, let's see, I'm gonna go right here. The World Bank now encourages the use of declining discount rates for financing dams. The first agency to adopt this, the World Bank, took about 10 years to get that through. And as I mentioned, the Mekong River is doing well. We've learned how to manage sediment from the Chinese and from others who have been forced to do it from their natural resources. To do it here in the United States, there are some regulatory issues. For example, 1972 Clean Water Act is passed. The idea, keep sediment out of the water. Sediment was and still is considered by many to be a pollutant, not a natural part of the landscape. And so what if we want to pass sand from the upstream side of Gavins Point to the downstream side of Gavins Point? Let's say it's technically and economically feasible. Good luck. Because you've now got the Corps of Engineers 404 permitting process and several states 401 permitting process to go through. To move sediment downstream, which is a viable alternative often, is really difficult because the regulators who give the okay on what you're going to do, they haven't faced this issue before. People don't come to them and say, hey, we want to move sediment downstream. Their initial reaction is, you've got to be kidding me. You can't do that. But then after talking about restoring a sediment balance, the ecosystems downstream, they warm up to the idea, but it's still really difficult for them to permit it because it hasn't really been done. Now, I wish that Paul Boyd, a friend of mine, could have been here today, but he's up at Guernsey Reservoir in the North Platte doing the annual silt run. They empty the reservoir every year and move the silt downstream. That was begun before these acts were passed. So Guernsey is kind of a grandfather clause. Spencer Dam passed sediment downstream for decades without these permits because they've been doing it before the legislation was passed. But nonetheless, recently, Spencer Dam went through the 404 and 401 process to have regulatory approval. Okay, well, this has been kind of a stark discussion. There are glimmers of hope here, and that's what I hang on to. There are things we can do. Technically now we know more than we did before. Financially, we can use some more common sense. And if not to fix what we've done so far, certainly to do a better job for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.